Before we begin, understand this clearly and without distraction. Holding cash feels safe not because it protects you, but because it reduces uncertainty in the short term, and the human brain is wired to prioritize immediate relief over long-term outcomes, which is why saving money is universally taught as a virtue, while the hidden cost of doing nothing with it is rarely explained, even though that cost quietly compounds over time. Cash represents certainty. When money is sitting still, visible, and untouched, it creates a psychological anchor that tells your brain you are prepared, protected, and in control, because unlike investments, assets, or decisions that involve uncertainty, cash requires no thinking, no timing, and no responsibility beyond preservation, and this is precisely why it feels comforting, especially in a world filled with volatility, instability, and constant change. From an early age, most people are conditioned to associate safety with accumulation, not deployment, being told to save for emergencies, save for the future, save for stability, and while none of these ideas are wrong on their own, what is rarely explained is that money, unlike physical objects, does not remain neutral when left untouched, because it exists inside a system that constantly changes its value relative to everything else around it. This creates a dangerous illusion, because while the number in your account remains the same, the world it must operate in does not, meaning prices rise, costs shift, purchasing power erodes, and what once felt like stability slowly becomes insufficiency. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but gradually, invisibly, and silently enough that most people do not notice until years have already passed. Inflation is not experienced as a single event, but as a slow adjustment of expectations, where small increases are normalized, justified, and absorbed into daily life, making people feel like nothing is wrong, even as their money quietly loses its ability to protect them. And because this process lacks emotional intensity, it rarely triggers action or urgency. The reason cash feels safe is not because it preserves wealth, but because it avoids decision-making, and decision-making introduces the possibility of error loss and regret, which the brain actively tries to avoid, especially after experiencing financial stress, instability, or uncertainty earlier in life. For many people, holding cash is less about strategy and more about emotional recovery, a way to regain a sense of control after periods of chaos, debt, or unpredictability. And while this instinct is understandable, it becomes problematic when temporary protection turns into permanent stagnation. The longer cash remains idle, the more it begins to work against its owner, not by disappearing, but by failing to adapt, because money must either grow, defend itself, or be strategically positioned, and when it does none of these things, it slowly falls behind everything else that moves forward. This creates a paradox where people who are disciplined savers often feel confused, frustrated, and betrayed, because they did what they were told, avoided risk, delayed gratification, and acted responsibly, yet still find themselves struggling to keep up with rising costs, shrinking margins, and increasing pressure, leading them to believe the problem is personal rather than structural. The structure itself rewards movement and penalizes stillness, because capital that circulates, compounds, or produces value adapts to change, while capital that remains static absorbs every negative shift without resistance, making cash a passive participant in a dynamic system that constantly reshapes its usefulness. Another layer of the illusion is visibility, because cash is easy to measure, track, and observe, creating a false sense of clarity, while losses caused by inflation are abstract, delayed, and indirect, making them easy to ignore even though they are just as real as any explicit expense. Over time, this leads to a mindset where people equate safety with immobility and risk with action, even though in reality, the greatest long-term risk often lies in refusing to adapt, refusing to learn, and refusing to reposition resources as conditions change. The system reinforces this behavior by promoting narratives that reward caution over understanding, telling people to avoid mistakes rather than teaching them how systems function, which keeps them focused on preservation instead of positioning, and fear instead of strategy. As a result, many people become trapped in a defensive financial posture, constantly protecting what they have rather than preparing for what is coming, which limits growth, reduces optionality, and increases vulnerability over time, even though everything feels calm on the surface. This is why holding cash can feel peaceful while quietly increasing fragility, because peace is being purchased at the cost of adaptability, and stability is being mistaken for safety, even as the foundation slowly weakens. Understanding this does not mean cash is bad, useless, or dangerous by default, but it does mean that cash has a role, a purpose, and a context, and when It is used outside of that context, it stops being a tool and becomes a liability. The problem is not saving, but stopping there, believing the journey is complete, when in reality, saving is only the beginning of a process that requires awareness, movement, and intention, without which money slowly loses its relevance in a changing world. This illusion persists because it is comfortable, familiar, and socially validated, and because confronting it requires questioning deeply ingrained beliefs about money, risk, and responsibility, which is uncomfortable but necessary for long-term stability. By the time most people realize that holding cash has not protected them the way they expected, inflation has already done its work, expectations have shifted, and rebuilding momentum feels harder than it would have if adaptation had begun earlier. This is not a failure of discipline, but a failure of education, because people are taught what to do but not why. And without understanding the underlying mechanics, they are left vulnerable to slow, invisible forces that erode progress without warning. And this sets the stage for the deeper issue, which is not just about money, but about behavior, perception, and the way safety itself is defined inside a system that constantly changes. Once you understand that cash loses value not through action, but through inaction, the question shifts from how much you save to how your money is positioned relative to time, change, and uncertainty. Because the real threat is not volatility, but stagnation inside a moving system. The greatest cost of holding cash is not numerical loss, but opportunity decay, because every unit of currency that remains idle is a unit that fails to learn, adapt, or compound alongside the environment it must eventually operate within, and this lost adaptation compounds quietly over years. This creates a widening gap between those who understand positioning and those who rely solely on preservation. Not because one group is smarter, but because one group is taught how systems behave over time, while the other is taught how to avoid discomfort. Cash teaches passivity if left unchecked, because it rewards waiting without demanding engagement, reinforcing the belief that doing nothing is safer than doing something imperfectly, even though imperfection is often the entry point to understanding. Over time, this passivity becomes identity, where people define themselves as cautious, conservative, or responsible, without realizing that responsibility also includes learning how to respond to change rather than hiding from it. The world does not punish caution immediately, which is why the danger is so subtle, but it does punish rigidity over long periods, especially when systems are designed to evolve continuously through technology, policy, and economic shifts. Holding cash without a strategy also creates emotional friction, because as prices rise and margins tighten, people feel pressure without clarity, stress without direction, and anxiety without a clear cause, leading them to believe they need more money, when in reality, they need a different relationship with it. This misunderstanding keeps people chasing higher income while ignoring structure, believing that earning more will solve a problem created by positioning, which only delays the realization that income alone cannot outrun systemic erosion. The correct role of cash is not to sit indefinitely, but to act as a buffer, a stabilizer, and a transitional tool that allows movement, not as a final destination, because money that never moves never adapts. Cash is meant to provide flexibility, not permanence. And when it is treated as permanent storage rather than temporary positioning, it loses its usefulness and becomes vulnerable to every force it was meant to protect against. Understanding this reframes risk entirely, because risk is no longer defined by action alone, but by inaction in environments where conditions change, meaning the safest path is often not stillness, but informed movement. This shift in perception is difficult, because it requires accepting that safety is dynamic, not static, and that security must be actively maintained rather than passively preserved, which challenges deeply rooted beliefs about money and control. Those who successfully navigate this transition do not abandon caution, but refine it, learning to distinguish between reckless movement and strategic positioning, and between fear-driven avoidance and informed patience. This is where education matters, because without understanding how systems work, people are left choosing between extremes, either freezing in place or jumping blindly, when the real solution lies in measured, intentional engagement. Cash becomes powerful again when it is integrated into a broader framework that acknowledges time, inflation, opportunity cost, and adaptability, rather than being isolated as a symbol of safety disconnected from context. When money is understood as a tool rather than a shield, behavior changes, decisions slow down in the right places, accelerate in others, and fear begins to lose its grip because clarity replaces uncertainty. This does not require immediate action, aggressive risk, or complex strategies, but it does require awareness, patience, and a willingness to learn how positioning matters more than accumulation over long horizons. Most people never reach this stage because the system rewards short-term comfort over long-term understanding. And because questioning the role of cash threatens deeply held beliefs that feel safe precisely because they are familiar. But once the illusion is broken, it cannot be unseen. And money is no longer viewed as something to hoard, but something to steward, protect, and position intelligently over time. This understanding creates resilience not because it eliminates uncertainty, but because it prepares you to respond to it, which is the real definition of financial stability. If this perspective changed how you see money, understand that this channel exists to expose the hidden mechanics behind everyday financial decisions, not to promise shortcuts, but to build clarity, patience, and structural awareness. Make sure you are subscribed, because in the next video we will explain why most people wait far too long to move their money, not because they lack resources, but because fear disguises itself as caution, and once you understand that pattern, your relationship with money will never be passive again.